Okay, so today I'm going to digress a little bit because there's something I want to talk about in terms of our preparation for Purim and Pesach. Just wait a second. And that is, we began last week, we began with the Daled Parshiyos. The Mishnah Megillah tells us there are 4 special Torah readings in the month of Adar, or the Shabbos before. Again, it depends if it's Rosh Chodesh Adar or the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Adar. And these are maftirs. So in other words, we read the regular Parshas HaShavua, but then we have a special maftir reading. And the 4 Parshiyos are Parshas Shkalim, Parshas Zachor, Parshas Para, Parshas HaChodesh. And since Rosh Chodesh Adar does not fall out on Shabbos, so Parshas Shkalim is the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Adar that happened to be last week. So I want to talk a little bit about Parshas Shkalim and what it actually represented. You know, the 4 Parshiyos actually were 4 very special Shabboses. We don't make a big deal. I mean, we don't do anything other than read an extra Torah reading. But in the time of the Rishonim and even in Eastern Europe, in the Shtetlach before the war, these were like festive Shabboses. They were like special gatherings that would get together among Hasidim. These were a very, very big deal. And in fact, there is a whole genre of piyutim that's virtually defunct, not quite. These are called yotzros. These are, in fact, every siddur has it. You'll even look in the Art Scroll siddur. They'll have it. Special hosafas to the Chazaras Hashatz of Shachris and Musaf for Shkalim, Zachor, Para, and Chodesh. And in fact, Rashi himself wrote a parish on the Yitzchak. You see how important those Yitzchak were, that even Rashi explained them and the like. Today, the Yitzchak are not quite defunct. They're in every siddur, number one. In fact, I remember in the Young Israel I grew up in, we used to say Yotzros. And they're said by Hasidim, and they're said by Yekis. So Yekis and Hasidim say the Yitzchak. Sfardim Bechlal don't say it because the Yitzchak are Ashkenazic creations, and most Yeshivisha Ashkenazic minyanim don't say them either. So that's a whole interesting sociological issue, how the yeshiva world can be blamed for the destruction of minhagim. Again, it's an interesting idea because yeshivas were institutions that attracted talmidim from a number of countries. So in any given yeshiva, Volozhin, let's say, you had Jews from Germany, from Poland, from Russia, from Lithuania, from different provinces, and they all had different minhagim from home, but in order to create standardization, so more or less none of the minhagim were followed, and as a result, yeshivisha culture, I'm going to get hate mail for this, but okay, yeshivisha culture is largely bereft of the diversity of minhagim that existed prior to the international yeshiva, meaning there were always yeshivas. I mean, yeshivas were around since Avram Avinu, but yeshivas used to be local, meaning to say every city had its own yeshiva. So in Hungary there was yeshiva, etc. So people kept all of those minhagim. But when you started with the international yeshiva, Volozhin was really kind of the first really international yeshiva. At that point, you began, although Lagabe Torah was a wonderful thing, but Lagabe Minhagim got kaput. For example, Ohr Somayach is a little different than a lot of places, meaning Ohr Somayach, we still have our Svardik minyanim and the like. You know, a lot of yeshivas didn't have that idea, meaning everybody had one minyan and you did what the yeshiva did, and there was no concept that Svardim had their own minyan and the like. So you can write a doctoral dissertation, and probably there is one, I'm not familiar with it, which talked about how the advent of yeshivos kind of destroyed the uniqueness of minhagim. So among the casualties were the Yitzchak, that in yeshivisha culture, they tend not to say Yitzchak at all. But nevertheless, you look in the Art Scroll Machzor, and the Yitzchak are written by our good friend Rabbi Elazar Kalir, who wrote the Kinos, and the Yotzros of Piyutim of Yamim Noraim, etc. And as is everything he writes, there are so many allusions to Midrashim and to Chazals. If you wouldn't know the Medrash, you wouldn't know it from the Piyut. But if you know the Medrash, you then see it in the Piyut, and the Meforshim try to identify the many, many Makairis. So the 4 Parshiyos at one point in our history was in fact a very, very big deal. It's tended to become much less emphasize today. And the only aspect that most of us practice is the special Torah reading, which is a chiyuv. That's a chiyuv from the Mishnah itself. Yeah. You had your hand up.
Did the yeshivas in Europe have a significant number of Sephardi students?
No, they did not, as a matter of fact. So maybe that's the difference. But still, if Volozhin didn't accommodate Hungarians, I'm not sure they would have accommodated Sephardim. So they just didn't have these separate minhagim. Okay, but again, as I say, one could debate this and one could argue about this and the like. Also, there was a concept, Volozhin had another aspect to it, which is interesting. They say, I can't say for sure because Volozhin had so many apikorsim that sometimes the accounts from the apikorsim are not necessarily reliable. But at least the less religious students of Volozhin write that Volozhin had a very quick davening and they didn't want anything to be marich because of Limud Torah. So anything that could be cut was cut. That the Shachris was like 25 minutes and the like. So that might also be an issue of why they eliminate Yotzros and Piyutim and the like, because they held it was Bittul Torah. But again, as I say, I don't want to say that for sure because some of these accounts come down from Talmidim of Volozhin who went off the derech. Yeah.
In regards to that, what about like Fancy Kaddish? Is that something that everything would be included in that explanation?
Why we have Chatzi Kaddish?
No, I'm saying in Volozhin, is this report included?
Yeah.
They would do half.
Oh, Kedusha, you mean?
Yeah.
I believe that was the case. In fact, the idea of the half of just doing the until Kedusha started really it's brought down in Halacha as a possibility when you're running out of time. But the notion of doing it for Mincha Gedola originated in the yeshiva for Bittul Torah reasons. L'chatchila, you shouldn't do it, but they held that Bittul Torah was like a b'diavad, meaning they were so makbid on Bittul Torah that they allowed. In fact, Volozhin was against Musar. They considered Musar to be a Bittul Torah. All sorts of issues about that. Rav Chaim Volozhin, who was the founder of Volozhin Yeshiva, wrote Nefesh HaChaim, right? Now, Nefesh HaChaim could be described as a Musar Sefer in some ways, and it's brought down that Nefesh HaChaim was not learned in the Volozhin Yeshiva. He wrote the Sefer, but they said it was Musar. We don't do Musar in Volozhin and the like. Yeah.
Do we know how much time they spent on lunch, dinner?
On what? On
lunch and dinner and stuff?
I don't know. The problem was there was no kavias really because Volozhin did not have a dining room and did not have a dormitory. So everybody, in terms of meals, everybody had to make their own arrangements. And also Volozhin had very little active hashkacha over Talmidim. So because the people who were learning, but people would eat when they ate, and everybody may have had a different time. There was no official thing. Volozhin had a sheet of kind of trusting the guys. You're adults. There was not like people watching you all the time.
Surely there could have been multiple minyanim.
There could have been multiple minyanim. I'm not sure if there was a particular rule on it, but at least the minyan of Volozhin itself was described as being very, very fast.
Does it make sense to Rebbe that they would do Heicha Kedusha because of Bittul Torah? That sounds strange to me.
It sounds strange, and I wouldn't encourage it. If you'd ask Rav Chaim Kanevsky, he would absolutely say not to do that, because tefillah should be in its fullness of its dignity. And the truth is, the Gra himself talks about the fact. The Gra says that tefillah is never called Bittul Torah unless it's more than 3 hours a day. The Gra writes that you shouldn't daven more than 3 hours a day, because that's already Bittul Torah. The mashmos of the Gra is that up to 3 hours a day is not Bittul Torah, right? So certainly a 3 hour a day tefillah can give you plenty of time for Shachris. You can have an hour and a half Shachris and plenty of time for a very slow Mincha, very slow Ma'ariv. So the notion of a Heicha Kedusha wouldn't make sense according to the Gra himself. But what happened is that the Volozhin eventually developed certain hanhagos that were, different than the Gra and different than Rav Chaim of Volozhin himself over the many, many, many years. Yeah.
Does that apply for holidays as well?
No, holidays would be different. Yom Tovim, I think, would be longer. Although it's interesting about singing. Again, we don't have as many eyewitness accounts as we would like, but singing was not, Bichlal, in Europe, singing was not a big thing, meaning to say, even the Chadodi was not necessarily sung. In some of the big cities, but not in the yeshiva minyanim, they had chazanim who would do famous chazanis, and people would even come to listen to the chazan. But the notion of congregational singing is actually an American invention, and I can even give you the dates of it. It was kind of invented by the Young Israel movement. Now, many of you might come from shuls, Young Israel. I grew up in a Young Israel shul myself. Now, Young Israel was a movement that was started in the United States in the 1920s. Now, in the 1920s, there were very, very few yeshivas, very few Orthodox Jews. And the Orthodox Jews who came were old people from Europe, and most of their kids were not Orthodox. Young Israel was an attempt to keep young people, teenagers and people in their 20s, to keep them Shomer Shabbos. And they succeeded to some degree. And in order to do that, they felt they had to modernize the synagogue in a few ways. Number one, the sermons had to be in English and not Yiddish, because some of the new kids didn't know Yiddish. Number two, they introduced singing. They thought that by having people sing along, they would be more involved in the service instead of just listening to a chazan do an aria or whatever it is. So the Young Israel movement kind of invented the notion of congregational singing, which has now spread, even to the yeshiva world. People like a nigun. And then number three are things they did which are really already stretching it, not just stretching it, going over the line. They had mixed dancing in a lot of Young Israels. And their cheshbon was, this was a cheshbon, their cheshbon was that this was a way to prevent intermarriage. Intermarriage was, and it still is, a real danger. So they made a cheshbon, some of the people made a cheshbon to have Jewish boys and Jewish girls kind of meet together in a chaperoned environment, and if they danced, they danced. They're over on the Isser, they're over in plenty of Isurim, but they thought that this was kind of an emergency situation to prevent intermarriage. Now, this last step was especially controversial, very controversial, and when Gedalim visited America, like Rabbi Chanan Wasserman and the like, who came for fundraising before the Holocaust, they signed charamim, they signed bans, excommunication bans, that the Young Israel was not allowed to do this. Some synagogues complied, and some synagogues did not comply. Today, Young Israel became, I wouldn't call it Haredi, but they're a little stricter in this. So today, Young Israel would not allow, no Young Israel would allow mixed dancing. But back in the 1920s, 1930s, this was a very common thing, and of course it was wrong, but you have to understand the situation. People thought that, listen, better to have a Jewish boy dance with a Jewish girl than for them to marry a shiksa, to marry a guy. So they thought that those things were necessary at the time. But as they say, the Gedalim were very, very strong. The mamish condemned it. Yeah.
Europeans didn't sing. Was it a culture thing or was it a shkafa?
Was it, say again, when?
When Europeans didn't want to sing.
See, it's not that they didn't want to sing. It's like they just weren't doing it. They just didn't do it. It hadn't been done. It was not a thing. They'd sing Zemiros at home and the like. But the notion that you come to shul and you sing, you come to shul and you daven. You don't come to shul and you sing. So it really was invented in America. But then it spread. And, many people think, it's a good idea. It helps people with kavana and the like. But even then, you got to be careful. Sometimes about tefillah, you need to match. That's a whole little chachma, a little bit. You need to match the nigun to the words. Meaning to say, sometimes people might use like some crazy nigun to words that are, for example, the sonnet. Just you're talking about tshuva, tefillah, tzedakah. Cancel the evil decree. So someone uses a real fast, lebedik, nigun to. On Rosh Hashanah, God decides who will die. You have to pick a nigun that fits the spirit of what the words are. And sometimes people would use, I'm sure you've heard it over the years, the Puff the Magic Dragon, or, some secular music to something, just because they like the tune. And a chazan should always match a nigun to the ideas of the tefillah. So you have to understand what the tefillah is saying. Yeah.
A non-yeshiva environment.
Yeah.
How do they reconcile doing Hegel Kedusha if they're not, if it's not her big Torah reason?
It's not proper. It's just not. It's not proper. It's not proper. One should have a full Shmona Esrei and a full Chazaras Hashatz. I mean, it's not proper. How do they justify? I mean, the way everything gets justified. They say, well, if some people are Mekel, I can be Mekel. But that's not really true. There are kulas. If you're going to miss, if it's close to Shkia, you're going to miss the Zman. That's for sure. And Bittul Torah might be a kula, etc. But the Stam Avehechik Kedusha is not at all correct. If people do it, they do it because, like anything else, they see people doing it when it's justified, and they assume it's mutter when it's not justified. And like, yeah.
With the Graz attributing 3 hours for davening, would that extend to singing as well, do you think? If we could comment on...
He didn't say exactly. This was almost a throwaway remark. I mean, he just says in the middle, it's not nachon to spend more than 3 hours in tefillah. He doesn't tell us what you do with those 3 hours. I mean, I can assure you that in the Graz Minyan they didn't sing. that's for sure. So he was talking about. So you want to say maybe we should? So you say maybe we get an extension for singing. I doubt it. I think the Gra would say, if you're going to take more than 3 hours, better not to sing and keep it under 3 hours. I don't think the Gra would say, oh, for singing, you get an extra hour, or whatever.
Would you think he would allow even up to 3 hours with singing, though? Or was that only for real Kabbalah during your davening, focusing on the words?
No, I don't think it's such a mechanical rule, meaning you can devote 3 hours for davening in whatever way maximizes your kavanah. Okay. If the singing maximizes your kavanah, so your 3 hours can be with the singing. The ikar is the kavanah, and the Gra held that up to 3 hours is not a bittul Torah, because fakert, how do you understand it? Hashem gives you siyata d'shmaya, right? So through a proper tefillah with kavanah, I will accomplish in less time what might have taken me more time to accomplish. So I'm not losing, and not only that, maybe I'll accomplish much more in the zuchos of tefillah. So it's not shayach to look at tefillah as bittul Torah. I mean, in a literal way. Well, when I'm davening, I'm not learning. Okay, beseder. But you're not losing in your learning by tefillah. But the Gemara does say there's a gavul. He says 3 hours is a gavul. You have to not go beyond 3 hours. But 3 hours is so much time. That for sure you're going to be able to do it. Okay. Alrighty. So this was a digression, but okay. So it's interesting. These are maybe what you might call some of the sociological aspects of the international yeshiva. Because again, Volozhin was a chiddush. Yeshivos had been regional until that time. Volozhin created the notion of the international yeshiva, and that had some impact on Minhagei Yisrael, and that's why yeshiva bachrim are notoriously weak on minhagim. Because, well, number one, especially if you're a Baal Tshuva, so you didn't necessarily have a lot of minhagim from home, and you don't pick up a lot of minhagim from here, right? So you're kind of bereft of traditions and misoros that are passed out. In fact, it's very interesting. Again, I'm getting off on digressions, but it is very interesting that, in a way, there's a little bit of a reversal, meaning for many, many, many years, really since Volozhin, yeshiva bachrim have been moving away from minhagim. No Yitzchak, no piyutim. I know in Baltimore there was an old Yeki shul, Glen Avenue shul. Some of you are from Baltimore, you may have heard of it. And this was a famous German shul, piyutim. If the Machzor has 1,000 pages, they start at page 1 and they finish at page 1,000. They say everything, beginning to the end. But they weren't attracting their own children. B'nai Torah were not going to that shul. They didn't want a shul with Yitzchak and piyutim and davening going on for so many hours. So they would go to Yeshiva Sheminyanim, where they did a quick, regular, standard davening, and Glen Avenue was losing membership. But all of a sudden, we find that now, the later generations now are mishtaikek to go back and reclaim the old minhagim of their great-grandparents. So now, a number of B'nai Torah have started the old Yekesh shuls, particularly the German ones, which say piyutim and say yotzros and do all of these old things that generations of B'nai Torah were trying to get out of. So this has mainly come from Yekis. It's mainly the Yeki generation that are doing it. But other groups follow it as well. So it is interesting that there's a pendulum in which people are trying to recapture the minhagim and the unique features of their avodah. Sfardim have always been a little better in this. Sfardim have been very tenacious in trying to hold on to minhagim. That's why they managed to get their separate minyan, even in the yeshiva world. It's a little bit of a chiddush. But again, it's a sociological study about minhagei Yisrael. But okay. But let me just point out that the one thing about Parsha Shkolim that is mandatory is the Kriyas HaTorah. That's not a question of minhag, whether you're Ashkenazi, Sfardi, Taimani. You are mechuyev on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Adar, or if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Shabbos, to read the Maftir, both the Haftarah and the Kriyas HaTorah, about the mitzvah of Machtzis Hashekel. That is in the Mishnah itself. So let's talk about a little bit what is the mitzvah of Machtzis Hashekel. First of all, let me state the obvious. The half shekel that was given Bisman HaMikdash is a lot more than the half shekel today. Don't confuse the nomenclature. The half shekel Bisman HaMikdash was probably the equivalent of around $50 in terms of modern currency, in terms of silver weight and the like. But what is the halacha? The halacha is that every year people, now this was an obligation on men, some say only from the age of 20, would have to contribute a half shekel as a tax to the upkeep of the Beis HaMikdash, or in the midbar of the Mishkan. Now, this was not a building funds contribution. This was an operating budget contribution, meaning the half shekels were what financed the purchase of korbanos. Remember, the Beis HaMikdash, the Mishkan, and later the Beis HaMikdash, had many things that had to be offered every day. Now, we're not talking about your private offering. If you have to bring a sin offering, you have to bring a burnt offering, that's your money. That has nothing to do with Machtzis HaShekel. Machtzis HaShekel was for a Korban Sibor, the communal offerings of Am Yisrael. So the Korban Tamid, the 2 lambs that were brought every day, came from the Machtzis HaShekel. All the Musaf offerings came from the Machtzis HaShekel. The Ketores that was brought twice a day came from the Machtzis HaShekel. The Ketores of Yom Kippur came from the Machtzis HaShekel. The oil of the menorah would be purchased. Well, sometimes the Beis HaMikdash made its oil, but the olives would be purchased from the Machtzis HaShekel. The Machtzis HaShekel was used for all of the Korbanos Sibor. Which now, here's the thing. The fiscal year of the Beis HaMikdash did not begin on Tishrei. It began in Nisan. Now, there's a Gezeres HaKosov that from the beginning of the year, which is Nisan, all korbanos, tzibor, have to be purchased from newly collected money, and you could not use a balance that was carried over. So let's imagine we have the year Tufshin Ayin Beis, that was last year. But again, it's not from Tishrei to Tishrei, it's from Nisan to Nisan. And let's assume when Nisan comes, let's say this year, right? Nisan of Tufshin Ayin Gimel, we still have leftover shekels that were collected for last year. We cannot use the leftover shekels for new Karbanos Sibor. What do you do with surplus? Actually, Maseches Shkalim, there's a whole Maseches. Maseches Shkalim, which deals with all the laws of Machtzis HaShekel. And Maseches Shkalim is really accounting rules. What do you do with surpluses? Meaning, how do you carry over a surplus? And it mentions you can use the surplus for city improvements or the like, but not for Korbanos. The Korbanos that are brought after Rosh Chodesh Nisan must be brought from shkalim that were contributed for the new year. Right? You cannot carry over a balance. Now that means by the time Rosh Chodesh Nisan arose, we had to have some new, now not everybody paid right away. People paid their shkalim over a long time. But there had to be some new shkalim in the treasury. So Rosh Chodesh Nisan, we could buy new animals. Right? You couldn't even use old animals. You couldn't use old money, and you couldn't use old animals that had been purchased from that old money. And you couldn't use old olive oil. I mean, again, what do you do with it is discussed, but you couldn't use it for the menorah. So, as a result, because there needed to be new shekalim by Rosh Chodesh Nisan, they had to begin collecting a certain amount of time before Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So there would be something in the temple treasury on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And Chazal say, the Mishnah says, they began collecting new shkalim 1 month before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and that is B'Echad B'Adar, on the 1st of Adar, Mashmi'in, we start announcing that people are supposed to give their shkalim. And therefore, the reason why Parsha Shkalim is read either on Rosh Chodesh Adar or the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Adar is a zecher. It is a commemoration to the fact that this was the time that people would begin giving their shkalim. Now again, this does not mean that everybody, just like, not everybody pays their taxes on time. This does not mean that everybody gives their Machtzis Hashekel by Adar or in the month of Adar. A lot of people didn't give it till the middle of the year, and some people didn't give it at all, and there's payment of back taxes. Shkalim were like back taxes that they would collect the next year. But nevertheless, they began collecting, or at least they announced donations from Rosh Chodesh Adar in order that they could buy new korbanos from Rosh Chodesh Nisan. All right, and that is what Parsha Shkalim is. So if you think about it, Parsha Shkalim in and of itself has nothing to do with Purim and has nothing to do with Pesach. It's not a Purim thing and it's not a Pesach thing. It is simply the time when we begin collecting Shkalim for the new fiscal year that begins Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Maseches Shkalim, by the way, is a little unique because it is the only Maseches in Seder Moed that does not have a Talmud Bavli. There is no Gemara Bavli on Maseches Shkalim, but there is a Talmud Yerushalmi, and in the Daf Yomi cycle, it is the one Maseches that they learn Talmud Yerushalmi, meaning you're learning Babylonian Talmud. When you hit Shkalim, you do Talmud Yerushalmi. Now, one could ask a very obvious kasha, well, how come I do that only for Talmud Maseches Shkalim? We have other Masechtas in Seder Zerayim that only have a Yerushalmi and don't have a Bavli. Really, all of Seder Zerayim except for Maseches Brachos, Peah, Shvius, Trumos, Maisros, Bikurim, Orla, all have a Talmud Yerushalmi. Now, what does Daf Yomi do about those Masechtas? It skips them, because since there is no Gemara, no Bavli Gemara, so they skip it. They don't do Yerushalmi. So one could ask a little bit of a kasha, why did the Daf Yomi cycle incorporate Yerushalmi Shkalim and did not incorporate Yerushalmi Peah, Demai, Trumos, and the like? I don't really have a complete answer. One answer might be that the Yerushalmi on those Masechtas is extremely difficult, and maybe it was thought that it would be hard to make it a mandatory part of a Daf Yomi cycle. Another might be an accident, although there are really no accidents, and that is, in a standard Vilna Shas, there is a Yerushalmi Shkalim that they print in the Maseches, and they don't print the Yerushalmi for Zerayim. Now, why not? That's enough. I'm just answering a kasha with another kasha. But given the reality that if you had a standard Gemara, you would have a Yerushalmi Shkalim in your Gemara, but you wouldn't have a Yerushalmi Peah in your Gemara. So as a result, they didn't want to create a system where people would have to buy their Yerushalmis, as it were, if they had a Bavli. So I don't know. It's a Tzarachian, but it's a little bit of a peculiarity in the Daf Yomi system that Yerushalmi is the only Shkalim is the only Maseches in which the Yerushalmi is actually learnt as part of the Daf Yomi cycle. Yeah.
Isn't the Shkalim that they collect a month before old? Considered old?
No, it's not old because it's being given for the new year. Meaning, even though it's earlier than Nisan, but I'm giving it l'shem, the new year that's going to be starting from Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Now, it's interesting that Machtzis HaShekel was collected from all Jews, even if you weren't living in Eretz Yisrael, and this created some major security problems, meaning it's recorded in historical chronicles that it would be like armored trucks, armored wagons, meaning huge amounts of silver would be sent from, let's say, Babylonia or Alexandria to Yerushalayim, and they're going through deserts and the like, and there would be armed guards. They would have a lot of armed guards because obviously there's a tremendous amount that could be robbed and the like. And we have several stories about robberies taking place, and the Mishnah itself deals with what are your obligations. What if you gave your shkalim, so to speak, but it got stolen before it was delivered to the Beis HaMikdash? Are you obligated to make up the loss, or have you done your obligation, right? So all of this is a very practical Masechta. What do you do with surplus money? We have accounting rules because you can't carry it over to korbanos. What do you do with deficits? What if all the shkalim that you collect, like the price of animals went up, and you don't have enough shkalim to cover your costs, right? What do you do with deficits? What do you do with surpluses? Who bears the risk of loss if there's geneva of the shkalim before it reaches Yerushalayim and the like? And of course, there's also all sorts of issues of currency exchange, because the Machtzis HaShekel was the coin of Eretz Yisrael. Now, you would be giving. You didn't necessarily have a half shekel coin, right? You would be giving your local currency. So the famous story, to bring in a little Christianity here, the famous story of Yashka and the money changers in the temple, right? Yashka comes up in the Beis HaMikdash. He sees the money changers in the temple. They're doing business. They're doing commerce. And he, upsets the tables because in the house of God, you don't do business. The money changers had a very, very important, legitimate role in the Beis HaMikdash, because they were the ones who were changing foreign currency into the half shekel coins. And they took a little bit of a commission. A little bit, there was a commission. They took a certain fee. So you'd have to give a little extra. You'd have to give a little more than the value of a half shekel. So when they take off their commission, you get back a half shekel, right? So you'd have to give a half shekel plus something, called the kolban was the name for the little bit of the commission and the like. So this is a perfectly legitimate point, because Jews were coming from all different countries. They had all different coins, and there had to be some kind of exchange rate plus a commission for the money changers. So I think Yashka overreacted on that one. This was an approved function. These were authorized people in the Beis HaMikdash, right? So that is what the Machtzis HaShekel represents. Yeah.
If there was a deficit for the new year's funds, could they use the old year's funds? Or?
If they did for deficit, generally not. They would have to kind of make a new collection. They would have to kind of basically say, we have to make up a shortfall. And the like. The Mishnah goes through what they can use old money for. They can actually use it for optional korbanos. It's interesting that there is a concept in the Beis HaMikdash that if no korbanos were being brought, there were no official korbanos, they could bring like voluntary offerings. And the old money could be used for the voluntary offerings, but you couldn't use it for the obligatory offerings. So that's what they do. Yeah.
That the Masechtos in Zerayim were kept out of Daf Yomi, like from Yerushalmi, because they were
Yep.
harder. That answer.
That's one answer, yeah.
What about like Eruvim?
Well, you know what? Well, listen. What's in the Bavli, you can't exclude. It's in the Bavli, so Daf Yomi is doing the Bavli. But when you're debating, should we include Yerushalmi, so that already they said. It's hard to gauge. Harder than Eruvin, there's probably nothing harder than Eruvin. Eruvin is a real hard Maseches. But still, the Yerushalmi is harder in another way, because the Girsa of the Yerushalmi is so indeterminate, meaning to say every other word is changed by different Hagos. So it's hard to even read the new Yerushalmis make it easier. Art Scroll has a Yerushalmi too. But until Art Scroll and the newer Yerushalmis, it was very, very hard to even read a sentence, because there was this change on the side, and that change on the side, and that change on the side, and the changes were not consistent, so it's hard to even have a girsa of the Yerushalmi. Yeah.
What's a non-obligatory korban?
No, in other words, this is literally a rule that when, let's say, there's like blank time, meaning to say there are no korbanos that are being brought right now in the middle of the day. So we're allowed to bring just extra korbanos. So those are called kayetz hamizbeach, and they were non-obligatory, but it was a way that the mizbeach should not be botel. So that could be from any type of money and the like. Yeah.
The armed guards who would protect the carts, were they Jews or would they hire?
They did both, but they certainly hired non-Jewish security sometimes. Yeah, absolutely. It was a major thing. I mean, like the armored cars, right? A lot of robberies to this very day occur with these armored trucks that transport. So today, because of computers, there is less physical gold and silver that's being transferred because you can move money by computer. But once in a while, they still have to transfer, millions and millions and millions of gold bars or whatever it is, and that's a huge security risk. It's always a huge security risk when those things happen. So they have guys with machine guns. So imagine the same situation with whatever weapons they had in the time of the Machtzis HaShekel. You had caravans of huge amounts of silver going through deserts that were filled with criminals and pirates and also by sea and the like. So security was a major issue with the Machtzis HaShekel. Yeah.
Do you know where in the base of Mikdash they were doing the money transfers?
Yeah, we know where it was. It was not. It was in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, not in the building, in the building itself, but in the courtyard where the altar was. That's what. Yeah.
Would it, if Mashiach came today, would it have to be physical stuff, or would it be able to be digital? Like, is there?
You're talking about the Machtzis HaShekel?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. Bitcoin as Machtzis HaShekel. I wouldn't rely on it. But I'm assuming that the mitzvah itself would have to be physical giving. You'd physically have to handle it. Okay? All right, so what I want to talk about tomorrow is, you have something? Yeah.
With the Machtzis HaShekel, with every, I know in America, some people, you said it was like around $50,
yeah.
But like a lot of times at places they say it's something around $10. And then sometimes they use like the Kennedy $50, and people say, I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, so let me explain something. Let me explain something to clarify the issue. The mitzvah of Machtzis HaShekel of the Torah only applies when there's a Beis Hamikdash and there are korbanos. When there's no Beis Hamikdash and there are no korbanos, there is no mitzvah of Machtzis HaShekel. However, it's brought down that there is a minhag of Am Yisrael, that we actually want to commemorate Machtzis HaShekel not only by reading about it, but on Erev Purim, the day before Purim, we give some money that goes to tzedakah, and that's called Machtzis HaShekel, Zecher LeMachtzis HaShekel. So the question then becomes, how much money do you give? So those are suggested amounts based on the commemorative Machtzis HaShekel. But it is not the Torah's Machtzis HaShekel. Okay, so don't confuse the Zecher LeMachtzis HaShekel and the Machtzis HaShekel itself. Okay, so this is kind of the halachic thing that Machtzis HaShekel is. Tomorrow we'll look at more of the spiritual meaning behind the mitzvah and what it might teach us in Avodas Hashem. Okay.